Hi, this is Bill again. It's session 3 of the Learning to Pray with the Apostles, and so we've been talking about the apostles learning what they thought about prayer, learning where they learned about prayer, and then in the next few sessions we're going to start diving into their prayers, having laid a context for them. But today we're going to talk about the Lord's Prayer, what we call the Lord's Prayer. And the Lord's Prayer, we're gonna use the one in Matthew 6. It's in Luke 11, of course, as well. But in Matthew 6, so a couple things to note as we begin is, like we mentioned last time, is that collective prayer is just the primary way they thought of it. Of course, Jesus talked about when you pray, go in your room and you need to have your own devotional life and that's really important. If you've ever been a part of corporate prayer, you can tell who's bringing something to share in the life of the prayer meeting and who's not bringing something to share in the life of a prayer meeting. So by all means. But one of the things you'll notice here is that our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name, your will be done, or your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Our Father, give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us. It's a corporate prayer. The Lord's Prayer is not an individual prayer. It's assumed as a collective prayer. So take note of that. And so next, let's just dive in. Let's dive in. So let's go to. We're going to come back to our Father, and I'll tell you why in a second. But let's start here. Hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. On earth as it is in heaven. So, hallowed be your name. It's like after working through the gospel, like many of you have in the other courses and things, one of the things you find is there's a lot more consistency between the Old Testament scriptures and the New Testament scriptures. And hallowed be your name is no example. So it's usually kind of viewed as like you have a stark, contrast, and this was all one way and now it's all a new way. And really pretty much the opposite is true, with the exception of the mystery of the Messiah's suffering and which was known by some, but and the gap between the two comings, but and you could say Gentile participation, but that's kind of another matter. So we'll go over that another time. But so hallowed be your name. So listen to this. Let's go to Ezekiel 36. Okay, so hallowed just means. Hallowed's an interesting verse, or it's an interesting word, because it's I think I have it written down here in the Lucan version, but exactly, so I don't mess these up. Right, so Father, hallowed be your name. It's an aorist passive imperative. Passive imperative is an awkward way to communicate. So what that means is it's passive tense, which means it's communicating an action being received by someone, not being done by someone. And an imperative is more like a plea or a command. In this context, more of a plea, but it's a plea that God would have his name be hallowed. Hallowed just means to made holy or sanctified. And so it's really a plea, Father, let your name be sanctified. And so this idea is just taken right out of a really simple passage to understand, Ezekiel 36. And it may have very well have developed from a tradition that came from Ezekiel 36 and other passages, because By way of introduction, I should have also said that there are also two other Jewish prayers at the time of Jesus. There's the Kaddish, and there's something that's a kind of a revision of what are called the 18 benedictions, and they're very, very similar. You know, our Father in heaven language. You know, let your kingdom come, these kinds of things. And it's always in the plural in both of those prayers. And so there's a lot of similarities. So there's probably a lot of tradition that developed from these ideas. But and Jesus is obviously communicating something that's familiar to the Jewish audience there. But so Ezekiel 36, verse 22. Therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord God, it is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations where you went. So profaned is like an antonym to make hallowed or to make holy. Profane means to make common. Holy means to make it stand out and look separate. And then verse 23 says, so because you profaned my name among the nations, I will vindicate the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations. The LXX, the Septuagint here, literally uses the exact same words. I will make my name hallowed. I will make my name holy. It's the same word as in the Greek text in Matthew. Which has been profaned among the nations, which you have profaned in their midst. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord, declares the Lord, when I prove myself holy among you in their sight. For I will take you from the nations, gather you from all the lands, and I will bring you into your own land. Sprinkle clean water on you, and I will make you clean. I will cleanse you from all your filthiness and from all your idols. This is what Jesus is teaching them to pray. So, the hallowed be your name. Hasten the day when you make your name holy. So now we can look at Father, because now we have a little bit of a grid work. So let's look at two passages. First, Jeremiah 3. Jeremiah 3 is a short reference. So, and the reason it's important to go over the Father reference is because another thing you hear a lot from the pulpit is, one, prayer is just talking to God. Number two, nobody ever addressed God as Father before. This is what's so unique. But that's not the case at all. It's not only written many times in prayers of the Old Testament, but in the Targums, the Aramaic translation, because most of the common people during Jesus' day probably didn't speak Hebrew, and so they had when they would read the scriptures in the synagogue, they would have an Aramaic translator. And the Aramaic translations have our Father many, many times. And so they heard that in the synagogue regularly. But here's a couple of the places where it's really clear that they're referencing in the Hebrew scriptures. So this is in context to them, the exile being prophesied by Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 19, he says, how I would set you among my sons and give you a pleasant land, the most beautiful inheritance of the nations. And I said, you will call me my Father, and you will not turn away from following me. So the Lord's talking about this day, how I long to actually set you among my sons, give you this beautiful land as your inheritance, and I will cause your heart not to turn away from me, right? That sounds really familiar to Ezekiel 36, right? I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you'll be clean, and you'll never again turn away from me, like in the New Covenant passages. You shall call me my Father, and you won't turn away from following me. Right? And so the next passage we're going to go to, just real quickly, are Isaiah 63 and 64. So, 63, starting in verse 15. Look down from heaven and see from your holy and glorious habitation, where are your zeal and your mighty deeds? So this is very much, because chapter 63, right, starts with the day of the Lord, and Yahweh coming up from Bozrah and from Edom with his garment stained with the blood of the enemies of Israel. And he comes and he vindicates the nation. And he brings them into their land. And so, in response to this vision, Isaiah says, "Look down from heaven, see from your holy and glorious habitation, where are your zeal and your mighty deeds? The stirring of your heart and your compassion are restrained towards me, for you are our Father. Though Abraham does not know us and Israel does not recognize us, you are our Father, O Lord. Our Redeemer, from old is your name. O Lord, why do you cause us to stray from your ways and harden our heart from fearing you?" This was a part of the covenantal hardening talked about at the end of Deuteronomy. "I will hide my face from them, and I will harden their heart so that they go into captivity." And then he promised an eschatological redemption. But the hardening, and Paul references the same thing in Romans 11, there's a hardening. "Return for the sake of your servants, the tribes of your heritage." And he continues to pray that God would have mercy on them, remove the hardening of their hearts, and vindicate them from their enemies who are oppressing them, because God gave their enemies to oppress them. Go to 64 now. It says, "Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains might quake at your presence," in response to their enemies. And then jump up to verse 8 in chapter 64 of Isaiah. "But now, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, you are the potter. All of us are the work of your hands. Don't be angry beyond measure, nor remember our iniquity forever. Behold, look now, all of us are your people. Your holy cities have become a wilderness, and Zion has become a wilderness, Jerusalem a desolation." So this is the whole anchor of the focus of the Lord's Prayer. The redemption from exile, that God would sprinkle them with clean water, establish a new covenant, because in the new covenant they were promised that God would give them a new heart and they would never turn away from fearing God again, the whole nation. And then he says, "Your kingdom come," and this ought to sound familiar from passages like Daniel 2. When in Daniel 2, obviously there's many references to the kingdom. And it holds the same framework as Acts 1. Are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel at this time? But specifically Daniel 2, Daniel sees the statue of the different empires, right? And then God, then he's beginning to explain it. And in verse 44, Daniel 2. "In the days of those kings, the God of Israel will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these oppressive kingdoms," or these kingdoms, but they're the ones that were oppressing Israel, "but it itself will endure forever." God will set up, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. And so they pray, "This kingdom that you are going to set up, that's going to crush our oppressors, let that kingdom come." Right? So it's the day of the Lord. So you have the restoration of the nation inaugurated by the day of the Lord, and the establishing of his kingdom on the earth, which will come when he crushes his enemies on that day. And then there's a little bit of a switch. And even though there's precedence for these things in the Old Testament as well, and in the Targums, we'll just hit on these real quickly, because these are the heart of these is real easy to understand. "Give us this day our daily bread." It's just simple. Obviously, the daily bread is a reference to manna. It's being sustained in the wilderness by God. It's an acknowledgement that we're awaiting, and we're in this place of tension where these things are not happening. We're like the children of Israel in the wilderness, depending on you until you cause an end of our exile. "Give us today our daily bread," like you did the manna, right? "And forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." And what's interesting is in Aramaic, this is a good this is good evidence for the Targums being really central during the first century, because in Aramaic, the only word for sin is literally the word debt. And so it's not just a creative use of it, it's the word that they heard in the synagogue every week. So forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And don't have time to go into it, but this is an idea that's totally consistent with the Torah. You couldn't just be angry and bitter with people according to the Torah. Lord said it was definitely not lawful for them to harbor bitterness towards people. And then you have verse 13, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. This is Isaiah 63 again. Why do you turn us away from you? Give us a heart that's inclined towards you. Deliver us from evil, Lord. Isaiah 63. Let's read it one more time. It says, why, O Lord, do you cause us to stray from your ways and harden our heart from fearing you? Return for the sake of your servants. So don't lead us into temptation, God. Deliver us from evil, we ask you. And so the Lord's Prayer is huge, huge, huge. But we have to understand that this is what it's about. It's about the redemption of Israel. It's about sustaining us in a wilderness time, providing for our needs in the meantime, and not inclining our hearts to go after the things of this age and the gods of the nations. And so obviously this is a Jewish prayer, but very applicable to us, those of us who share in the hope of the redemption of Israel, which I hope, if you've gone through any of the courses, I hope that you're with me in sharing this. So again, hope this has been a blessing, and look forward to the next one already. Much grace to you guys.